So Daniel chapter 5 verse 1 begins the story. King Belshazzar is now the king of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar, who we've been hanging out with in chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, died in 563 BC. The events in this chapter take place about 15 years later in 539 BC. King Belshazzar, who we meet in chapter 5, is the son of the current ruler Nabonidus. Kind of ruling together. The context in 539 BC and in Daniel chapter 5 is that the Medo-Persian army has surrounded Babylon outside the city walls. They're knocking on the door, man. But that doesn't stop King Belshazzar from throwing a raucous party.
Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000.
Belshazzar throws a banquet despite the presence of the Medo-Persian army that's besieging the city. Remember the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 of that great image? There was going to be a second kingdom that was going to come after Babylon, and they're looking at it. It's right outside their walls. Just a note here, later in the chapter, at least a couple times, Belshazzar is said to be the son of Nebuchadnezzar. We know who Nebuchadnezzar is, don't we? Nebuchadnezzar was not the literal father of Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. Nabonidus married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. Belshazzar was the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar and the 5th king after Nebuchadnezzar. There was assassinations and palace intrigue before we even get to Belshazzar's reign. The term son of or father of was a common term used in the ancient world. Oftentimes in the scripture, it's used to describe ancestors. You know, like the Jews calling Abraham their father, even though they're 1,000 years after Abraham existed. Kind of like that. But additionally, in the Bible, the term father is often used in the same sense as grandfather as well. So my point in all that is, Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 1 sets the scene. There's a banquet going on, there's drunkenness and partying. The Persian army is just right outside the walls. In verses 2 to 4, drunk King Belshazzar ridicules the God that King Nebuchadnezzar's decrees had exalted. That's how chapter 4 ended. Belshazzar ridicules the God of the Bible by using bowls that were dedicated to God and that were stored in the Jerusalem temple, and using those bowls as wine cups to get drunk on. He's getting drunk with holy relics, man.
While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them.
Now wait a second, it may seem kind of odd that Belshazzar's throwing a party when there's a besieging Medo-Persian army outside the walls. But this party had a purpose. This celebration was meant to boost morale and to break the feeling of doom. Because at this very time, the Medo-Persian army has got Babylon surrounded around their mighty walls. And if that's not enough, he's making offerings to pagan deities with God's holy relics. Notice verse 4.
They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone.
They praised the God of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. They were calling upon their deities to deliver them from the Medo-Persian army. Belshazzar and all the rulers of Babylon supposed themselves to be safe behind those massive walls of Babylon and their false deities. And what an image of so many people today who feel secure behind the walls of wealth or position or their religious background, never realizing that doom is near until it's too late. So in verses 5 through 12, while this revelry is going on, while this partying and calling upon the deities is happening, a hand mysteriously appears and writes on the wall. Freaky, man.
In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote.
Absolutely terrified, King Belshazzar demands an interpretation.
The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon,
"Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck. And he shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom."
So just like chapter 2, just like chapter 4, all the Babylonian wise men come in to try and interpret, but they can't because they haven't learned. And this is when Daniel is called upon. Now in verses 13 to 28, this is the big chunk of the chapter. Daniel interprets the message on the wall and announces to Belshazzar, since he has not followed his father Nebuchadnezzar's example by honoring God, the kingdom is going to be torn out of his hands. Daniel reminds Belshazzar of King Nebuchadnezzar's story. You remember his story, right? And he rebukes Belshazzar to his face.
But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this.
After Daniel's rebuke, he then interprets the message.
Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
Now in verses 29 to 30, the king keeps his promise to honor Daniel, to reward him. That very night, the Persians enter the city and Belshazzar is killed. Daniel's promotion to the third ruler in the empire turned out to be very short-lived. And verse 30 and 31 tells the doom of Babylon. So how did those Persians get through those mighty walls of Babylon? Well, 80 years later, the Greek historian Herodotus tells us. The Medo-Persian general had his troops dig a trench and thus lower the waters of the Euphrates River. Since the Euphrates River flowed through the city, lower water level enabled the Persian army to unexpectedly invade via the waterway which went under the walls. And they reached the city before the city was even aware. This happened on October 16, 539 BC. Bye-bye Babylon. Verse 31 tells us that Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Now who's Darius the Mede? History mentions no specific man named Darius the Mede. What? Darius is not a name, but it's an honored title for King Cyrus. With his army entered Babylon just a couple weeks later on October 29th, 539 BC. So that's Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar and the writing on the wall. And if there's anything we get out of this chapter, it's this point. Knowing isn't doing. Belshazzar knew how God had intervened in the life of his father Nebuchadnezzar. But knowing is not enough. God measures you and me not by how much truth we know, but by how committed we are to act upon it. Or as James says, be doers of the word, not just hearers of the word. So that was Daniel chapter 5. I love it. And that's week 5 in review. I'll see you next week for week number 6 when we go to Daniel chapter 6. It's going to be Daniel in the lion's den. See you next time. Boom!